You have a Secretary of Defense who doesn't care. He cares about Fox News. You have a deputy who's a very smart businessman but has no background in international politics or strategy whatsoever, and is, I think, overwhelmed, just trying to learn the building and run procurement and all that stuff. And then, you have a undersecretary for political affairs who thinks that he's Metternich, and he's not.
All right. Well, welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, a contributor to the Bulwark, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and the counselor at the Center for Strategic Budgetary Assessments. And I'm tan, rested, and ready to join my colleague in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, the Professor Emeritus of Strategy at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, contributing writer to The Atlantic, and also a fellow refugee from vacation, although he's still on vacation. Eliot, how are you?
Good. Well, I mean, you call it vacation. I call it inspecting the coastal defenses of New England.
Ah, there we go.
And I regret to report that the Chinese could really land across the beaches of Cape Cod unopposed. But since actually I've had a number of our listeners reach out to me about my last brush with wildlife on vacation, which, if you remember, was a bear looking in the window. As
I do remember.
We taped the previous episode while I was in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Here on Cape Cod, which I've been visiting since I was a boy, you now have to worry about great white sharks because of global warming. And in fact, we went for a walk on the beach, and there are these seals playing in the surf. And of course, where there are seals, it turns out there are great white sharks. And I just said to my wife, I hope the great white sharks prefer the taste of seal to the taste of grandchild, but you can never be quite sure. So, like I said, you can call it vacation. I just call it another exercise in terror.
Well, since it's the 50th anniversary of the release of Jaws, I think that the Cohen family should have a family showing for the grandchildren of Jaws, and that'll keep them out of the water for the rest of the summer.
Well, the thing is, there are these beautiful ponds on Lakeshore, on Cape Cod, but somebody was telling me, and I choose not to believe it, that there is flesh-eating bacteria in them.
Yeah, or brain-eating bacteria. So, I avoid ponds when at all possible. So we need to return to regular order on Shield of the Republic after having a couple of special episodes devoted to the Israeli and U.S. raids on the Iranian nuclear program, and that means we are back to the jackassery of the week. So, Eliot, what do you have for us?
Well, actually, I've been doing some research. Actually, this was, of course, handed to me by somebody, but it is a pretty great story. So on May 15th, Kari Lake, the new head of Voice of America, laid off 50 journalists and staff from the Persian service of VOA. And on June 3rd, she told Congress that she intends to take the Persian service down to two full-time people. Of course, on June 12th, the Israel-Iran war really broke out with a major Israeli attack. So on June 13th, Kari Lake recalled 40 VOA Persian service journalists and producers, which is a good move. And then on June 20th, she laid off all except 4 of them. And as a result, when Trump gave his speech, they were able to translate the speech, but basically there was no other real programming, no reporting, just nothing. And of course, they've reverted. They're going to try to essentially kill it off. And this is a piece of she's an idiot. This is jackassery. This is, I'm not somebody, as you know, who gets sappy about soft power. But there is something to be said for the United States broadcasting, particularly to nations which have tyrannical governments, simply to get the news out and to give them something to listen to. And as you and I have discussed, many of our East European friends, particularly in Poland, would say this was a lifeline during the bad old days, and it's absolutely true now. And this is something we should be doing. And, to kind of delight in getting rid of these people, it's jackassery. That's all I can say.
Yeah, it's jackassery and vandalism of the highest order. Well, I've got one as well, but it's more serious, I guess, or equally serious, maybe, which has been the herky-jerky, on-again, off-again tale of the suspension and then resumption of military aid to Ukraine. The timing of this, of course, could not have been worse, since it came, in the midst of the largest aerial bombardment that Ukraine has been suffering since the beginning of the war, with repeated attacks with literally hundreds of drones. July 4th, I think, was the largest attack with 500 drones. And this was absolutely on the morrow of the Trump-Putin phone call, which even Trump has seemed to realize was Putin giving him the middle finger. And the pretense is gone. I mean, the Russians are just targeting civilians. It's totally clear that this is meant to sow terror in Ukraine, and it's succeeding to some degree. I think there's been some demoralization of the population, and in the midst of all this, the United States says we're pausing, our transfer of military assistance to Ukraine. Now, on top of just the geopolitical foolishness of this, most of the weapons that were being withheld were being withheld on the argument that our munition stocks are being depleted. True, that's something we have been talking about on Shield of the Republic for nigh on 3 years, and the dangers of that. But the notion here was that our munition stocks were depleted, and we needed to preserve them for a potential fight in the Indo-Pacific. Except that most of, not all, but most of what was withheld, including the AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, which would be very helpful to Ukrainian F-16 pilots, haven't been used by the U.S. Air Force for a decade, nor are they likely to be, and certainly not in a high-end contingency with the PRC. Also, we're talking about anti-tank weapons, which are not really going to be kind of crucial to an Indo-Pacific. Patriot interceptors, maybe there's a bit more of a case there, but even there, I think this was done in a most extraordinary way. It was my successor as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who apparently made the decision, took it to the Deputy Secretary, got him to approve it. The Secretary wasn't really involved. It was over the objections of the J5, the Director for Political Military Affairs in the Joint Staff, who said, no, we don't need that stuff for the Indo-Pacific, and the J3, I'm told, the Director of Operations, and without regard to the service secretaries, who were the one charged by Title 10 of the U.S. Code with manning, training, and equipping the military services. So this was such a blatant act of jackassery that even the Trump administration realized it, and the president has now, in his infinite wisdom, reversed it, thank God. But the signal of inconstancy and on and off, support is really bad. It's bad for Ukrainian morale, and it sends exactly the wrong signal to the Russians. What say you?
So I have a couple of thoughts about it. One, just first to hammer home that point about the Russian attacks. They're growing in scale, in number, they're growing in sophistication. The Russians have been modernizing the drones that they're sending. There's talk of a Chinese support for the factories that are manufacturing these things. They're becoming more sophisticated, resistant to jamming. And you're right, they're going after civilians. One of the things that's particularly sinister and evil is double tap attacks, where you attack a civilian target, you wait a little bit, and then you hit again so you can get the emergency
The
responders.
first responders, yeah.
So that's absolutely true. I would. There's a technical point that I think we should return to because this is something that, to be perfectly honest, the Biden administration also did not want to face. The basic exchange ratio between defense and offense works in favor of the offense. Even if we didn't stop sending the Patriot missiles, even if obviously we should be sending all this stuff and more. It's easier to build systems that are going to attack, particularly if you're a country like Russia and you've got support from the Chinese and so on. And so there's this larger strategic issue, which is, you're not going to be able to kind of build an invisible shield around Ukraine. I wish we could. The alternative really is to help them win and to help them succeed, or simply to help them make the war so painful for Russia that Russia is willing to come to the table. By the way, the Ukrainians have been doing some things. So one of the things that they've been doing is attacks on various airports. So the entire Russian air traffic system is tied into knots. On the jackassery piece,
and the defense industrial base, they've been hitting defense industrial targets as well. And so this is a battle of cost imposition. And you're of course right that the marginal cost of increasing your drone capacity versus the defender's capacity puts the Ukrainians on the wrong side of the cost imposition curve.
The other thing that strikes me is, and this really gets to why this is jackassery and not simply, evil stupidity, is Colby, your successor, stops these shipments on his own authority, gets the deputy secretary is supposed to be a capable man, so why he signed off on this, God only knows. But the White House was apparently not informed. This sort of thing absolutely, in any kind of sane administration, would be a decision that the president would take or certainly be well informed about, and there'd be some sort of deliberative process where you would hear from people. So the jackassery here, in the same way that my jackassery of the week was really focused on Kari Lake, should be focused on Colby, your successor, who has been, I would say, monomaniacally focused on China, except he'll agree with whatever Trump says, to be sure, and has a view of the American strategic predicament, which I can only describe as simple-minded. That there's China, Indo-Pacific, and there isn't anything else. Middle East doesn't matter. Europe doesn't matter. Now, there's obviously subtle arguments to be made about where do you emphasize, where do you put more resources. A serious administration, if you're really convinced that the threat in the Indo-Pacific is a very serious and pressing one, which would say is, okay, we have a transition to manage here between spreading stuff around and really being focused on the Indo-Pacific. We work with our allies to say, look, these are the timelines. Here's where you guys need to step up. You would do it in a well-defined way. This was just, sort of spontaneous. It was kind of government by decree, and it does not augur well for the political military direction of the Pentagon, because, as you say, you have a Secretary of Defense who doesn't care. He cares about Fox News. You have a deputy who's a very smart businessman, but has no background in international politics or strategy whatsoever, and is, I think, overwhelmed, just trying to learn the building and run procurement and all that stuff. And then, you have a undersecretary for political affairs who thinks that he's Metternich, and he's not.
Yeah. So, this episode also, I think, reveals or underscores something we've talked about on previous episodes of Shield of the Republic, which is the breakdown of process. You mentioned that nobody at the White House knew. That's I think technically that's not 100% true. I think there's some people on the vice president's staff who knew, but I think that's indicative of the process breakdown, right? Because one person who clearly didn't know was the National Security Advisor, aka the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is, of course, got some responsibility for negotiating with the Russians on this, along with Steve Witkoff and Keith Kellogg, who negotiates apparently with the Ukrainians. Kellogg, as far as I know, was unaware of this. Susie Wiles, the chief of staff, was unaware of it. And the president has said he was unaware of it. He told Zelensky that, according to the Wall Street Journal. So the fact that there is no interagency process of any kind, we've talked about this. This is an example of what happens when you have a breakdown in process. You can have someone who, fancies themselves to be a policy entrepreneur and can try and take advantage of the void and pursue a personal agenda, which in this instance is actually, I think, undermining at least what the president says his agenda is, which is to try and get a negotiated settlement.
I think just to refine the point a little bit more, and then I want to ask you a question. When we say breakdown of process, we don't just mean anarchy, because there is that, that the system is not working. But exactly your point, policy entrepreneurs, people who, let's face it, would not be at the first rank, and maybe not even at the second rank in a quote unquote normal Republican administration, suddenly, by virtue of there not being a process, having at least for a time a great deal of discretionary power, which, human beings being human beings, Washington being Washington, they decide to exercise in arbitrary ways, which eventually get them in trouble. My question for you is this. You've heard me go on and on about Trump and my take on him, which has occasionally been, I wouldn't say sympathetic, but somewhat less dark. Less dark than yours often, and certainly less dark than other people. We both have friends, and I think, because they're on the record, we can invoke their names. Phil O'Brien, Ann Applebaum is another very good example, who have been out there making a very strong argument that basically Trump has thrown in his lot with Putin. He wants to align with Russia. He certainly hates Zelensky. He hates Ukraine too, as far as we can tell. And basically the United States is now on Russia's side. Well, I know what I think of that, and I think, I've articulated. But I would really like to hear from you, your view of Trump's position, because what struck me about this episode, in addition to, it's appalling, and the process point that you made, I absolutely agree with. But what struck me about it is that Trump decided to reverse it. And he reversed it in the midst of using language, which, by Trumpian standards, kind of thing I'd like to hear. So what is your theory of Trump in this case, but also your theory of Trump in general?
Yeah. So, first, I have enormous respect, as you know, for Anne and her work and her views, and we've had her, on the show
Me too.
twice, and her books are terrific. I have a slight disagreement with her here. I think she's perhaps overinterpreting a little bit, kind of where Trump is. So, first of all, Trump instinctively, I think, is drawn to and admires autocrats. And he does that because he's a wannabe autocrat himself, albeit more constrained than most of these guys that he, sort of admires, like Putin, like Erdogan in Turkey. But I think with Trump, a lot of times people are attributing. I think actually my view of Trump is maybe darker than theirs in a sense, because I think they're attributing more fundamental intelligence to him than he actually has. And I think actually Occam's razor here would argue that the most parsimonious explanation is that Trump sees everything, all of his experience, his life experience, inclines him to see everything as a transaction. And I think what he has wanted to do, and I think he still wants to do, is to normalize relations with Russia so that we can do business together. Because he's aspired to do business deals in Russia since the mid 1980s. And he and his negotiator, Steve Witkoff, have been, I think both of them are very easily influenced by blandishments of, people holding out the prospect of great business deals to be done. And in the case of Witkoff in Russia, that portfolio has been handled by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who's very close to Putin. His daughter, I believe, is very, very close to Putin's daughter. And I think he's been frustrated that he hasn't been able to do this because Putin won't play ball with him enough to get him a deal. Now, I think he still wants to normalize relations with Russia. I think that, if you, on the one hand, he has reversed, the arms deal because he sees what's going on with the attacks. And I think some of that's offended him personally because it's come right on the heels of his phone calls with Putin. It's very hard not to take that as a personal affront. But I also think he, the Treasury has been lifting sanctions on Russian banks at the same time. And he has refrained, despite imprecations from, close supporters like Lindsey Graham and others Ted Cruz impose sanctions on Russia. He's refrained from doing that. He and Rubio have, consistently said, no, we don't do that. In Rubio's explanation, it's because we don't, we want them to come to the table. We don't want them to, get ticked off and walk away. So I think this is all transactionalism. I don't think it's about alignment per se, although I don't think he would be opposed to aligning us with Russia if he were able to end the war and get some kind of agreement and then move on. But I don't think he's I don't think this is a reversal of alliances at this point. The same point is he went to the NATO summit, and because folks at NATO finally have figured it out, which is that the way to his heart is rank flattery, he's now Mark Rutte's daddy. And, everybody at NATO, they organized the NATO summit, as we discussed with Doug Lute right before it happened, explicitly to cater to Trump. Very short, a dinner and a 3-hour meeting in which everybody talked to Trump about how great he was and how they were all going to meet his 5% goal, which of course will never happen. But he walked away happy and not leaving the alliance. So to argue that it's a reversal of alliances, I think, is to overstate the case. Now, I don't think that takes anything away from his desire to build a, authoritarian structure in the United States with him at the head of it. I think he still has that. I think the big, beautiful bill that just passed is very frightening in terms of the amount of money it provides to what is essentially now a kind of Gestapo-like secret police at ICE. But I don't think, it translates into what Phil and Ann have argued.
I might go even a little bit further. He didn't have to reverse that decision. And he did reverse that decision, and he was public about it. He did have, I'm willing to believe that Zelensky's telling the truth when he says the conversation they had was a good one. So here are my thoughts. One is, the rubric autocrat is a very simple one. There are many different kinds of autocrats or would-be autocrats. So, for example, he is an autocrat who, unlike Putin, really doesn't like war. He is an autocrat who really, unlike Xi Jinping, really wants to be known as a peacemaker. I mean, I think I'm not saying that's because he wants to benefit humanity, but I think that's
But he wants
part
that
of
Nobel Peace Prize.
he wants that Nobel Peace Prize. And let's be honest, if I were him and I said, okay, I did the Abraham Accords, and Barack Obama, like 4 days in, gets the Nobel Peace Prize for what? He's got a point. Actually, the French news magazine L'Express did an interview with me, and that ended up being the headline they chose to put on it. He's got a point. He's got a point. I think,
Very
and I
small
want to be
point,
very.
but okay.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just trying to stretch your horizons here a little bit. I think there is also, and I absolutely don't want to overemphasize this, there is a bit of a humanitarian or kind of human element to him. I mean, it is really easy to turn this into a Marvel Comics supervillain. In the same way that, if you remember, they bombed Syria when he saw those pictures of kids who were gassed. One of the interesting pieces of reporting is that he had this exchange with this BBC reporter who's Ukrainian, and it apparently kind of got to him. And now, of course, Trump being Trump, there's some people say, well, I wonder if that was a setup. But I think there is something to that. I suspect he sees, because he's a visual guy, he's seeing pictures of apartment buildings going up in flames and crying people and people who've lost their kids. And I'm not saying that he's humanitarian. He's not. But I think those things touch him actually a little bit more than we sometimes give him credit for. I do think the process of getting exasperated with Putin has been going on for a long time. So I think there's something else here. I also think, and this is probably where, and like you, I have an enormous amount of respect for Anne. I think if you frame all this as being about European-style authoritarianism of either the Putin stamp or the Viktor Orban stamp or the Mussolini stamp, you're just barking up the wrong tree. I mean, this is American authoritarianism, and he is very much a product of early 21st century America. And I think it's just critically important to use that as your frame of reference for understanding what's going on. Last thing I'll just say on all this, and this is a broader point, which it's driving me more and more crazy. When people obsess about what an evil, terrible guy he is, and I agree, he's an evil, terrible guy. I mean, I've been saying that for over 9 years. It absolves you of the responsibility to say, well, how did we get here? Does the Democratic Party have some sort of responsibility for this? Does the Republican Party have some sort of responsibility for this? Do American elites have some sort of responsibility for this? And then you see it in New York
and the American public that elected him twice.
You see New York City, this great city. They may very well end up having a 33-year-old so-called democratic socialist who really hates the Israelis, refuses to acknowledge that Israel has a right to exist, and is actually quite happy with globalizing the Intifada, which means open season on Jews. Let's be honest about it. And you don't think that there's a reaction against that?
Sure.
Which people like Trump capitalize on, and
of course, it's a huge gift to Trump.
So I really have this feeling, and I dwell on it, Eric, because I feel we're going to have another 3.5 years of this. And I think we really have to have our heads screwed on properly if we're going to understand it, as opposed to just shaking our fists in the air. And in the same way that, look, I really don't like this massive expansion of ICE. Somebody said the other day it'll have a bigger budget than the Marine Corps, which I find hard to believe. But
that's true. It's bigger than the defense budget of all but 4 countries.
And people with masks who don't show not only do they not show their faces, they don't show their badges. That's appalling. It's just appalling. It's un-American. that doesn't mean that there isn't and hasn't been an illegal immigration problem, which there has been.
No, of course. Yeah. Right.
Well, you say of course, but
Look,
I think people are not willing to kind of say, well, the question is where. One question certainly to ask is, where does this come from?
right. No. I quite agree, and we spent a better part of 3 years critiquing the Biden administration, for turning a blind eye to that, to crime, to inflation, and that is very much, I think, part of how we got here. I guess. I mean, I can't quite. I take your point that Trump does not like pictures of dead children unless they're brown and being eaten by alligators, outside.
That's evil.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, there's no question that, he's repeatedly said that these pictures of dead kids and of blown out buildings. I mean, let's not forget this guy is a real estate developer. To him, the idea of blowing up a building is just like horrible. So I get all that. I don't think it's humanitarianism. I think part of it is, I think his feral sense of public opinion, as well. And there is some personal chord there. I guess it touches sort of, but no, look, I agree. We have to maintain our sort of analytic, capability to parse all of this. And look, it's the same thing about people. We've been through this now in a couple of shows, but the rush to judgment about the battle damage assessment after the strikes, with people dying to say that it failed,
Right.
because it was Trump. I mean, okay, look, I yield to no one in my opposition to Trump, but you have to look at this, where the evidence takes you. And by the way, I think you and I were pretty spot on. It's looking to me like they set the program back about, a year or two. That seems to be what the Pentagon thinks. Seems to be what the Israelis think. We've now got overhead photography of Fordo, and the Iranians have put cranes near one of the entry points for the GBU 57s, but not the other, because the ground probably is too unstable because of the damage that was done. So, I mean, we have to.
I think you're making it's a very telling point, because because people understandably loathe the guy so much. The built-in assumption is this has to have been a failure. It has to have been a bad idea. And, and unfortunately, I mean, it's more pronounced with Trump, but you and I lived through similar things with George W. Bush. I mean, people never quite got around to denouncing PEPFAR, for example, but I'm sure lots of them wanted to. And now I'll confess, with Obama and Biden too, people were reflexively critical. By the way, just on the bombing, I did have a runner-up for Jackassery of the Week, which was a former colleague of ours writing an article entitled "Iran's Khamenei Playing the Long Game." So an 86-year-old who's ill, playing the long game, in other words, being incredibly cunning after his entire strategy has collapsed. Hezbollah is out, Hamas is out, Syrian regime is out. His nuclear program's been bombed to smithereens. His air defenses are completely shot. All of his top nuclear scientists have been assassinated. All of his top military leaders have been assassinated. He's really clever, I mean, you can't.
Missile program is degraded.
It's Orwell's famous dictum that there's some ideas that are so silly you have to be an intellectual to believe them.
So, that brings me to another subject I think we should talk about, which is it was notable that Russia and China did very little to support Iran in its moment of need against both Israel and the United States. Both Russia and China, both Putin and Xi, basically called for an end to the conflict, de-escalation. there were some flights, military flights from China to Tehran while this was all going on. We don't know quite what was in those flights. They were cargo aircraft. Could have been military goods, could have been dual use goods. We don't really know. Putin was pretty frank, saying that, hey, we got about 2 million, Russian citizens and, dual nationals in Israel. So I've got equities I've got to balance. I mean, that's not quite what he said, but that was pretty much what he meant. Xi made it clear he didn't want the Iranians to close the strait because he's got some big equities there with access to Middle East oil. People seem to be, my sense, I'd be interested in yours, is that some people, there was an Ed Wong article in the New York Times saying, you see, all these people are talking about axis of upheaval or axis of autocrats. There's no axis. They're really, they all have an interest in, putting their finger in America's eye. But other than that, that's not really an alliance. They're not really, coordinating, et cetera. My sense is this, this is like really overdrawing the lesson here, and that it's a mistake to think that, that because they did not want to get into a fight with a regional military superpower and a global superpower over Iran, that means they're not willing to make use of Iran, to continue to use North Korea, and to support one another in making life miserable for Uncle Sam.
So I agree with you. I think let's remember these. You were talking about Trump as a cold-blooded transactionalist. These people are even more transactional, and unlike him, they're not quite as susceptible to flattery. So, they don't even have that scrap of human emotion. Let's not forget, by the way, the Iranians did really rather little to help Hezbollah, this proxy that they had cultivated as the Israelis demolished them. So on the one hand, it's true. They had concrete interests, I think particularly for the Chinese, who, they really don't want to see the flow of oil interrupted. With the Russians, by the way I interpret that is, I think the Russian Jews in Israel's smokescreen, I think they realized it was not a damn thing they could do. They need every scrap of air defense and anti-missile defense. They need to defend themselves against the Ukrainians. So what else really are they going to do? But I think the more important thing to everybody to remember is these are relationships which are now quite deep. There's some which we don't see. So I think the intelligence sharing relationships are probably quite interesting. And then the most worrisome at the moment, I think, is the military industrial one. If it is true that the Chinese are helping to build factories for drone production, I don't worry about Russian mass production because I just think they're not particularly competent. The Chinese are very competent at mass production of these technologies. So I think they are cooperating. I think the North Korea dimension, by the way, is actually quite important. They're providing laborers, they're providing soldiers, and you wonder what the heck they're getting in return. And my guess is it probably has to do with nuclear design, missiles, technology, and stuff like that. So these will be fraught relationships. This is not the band of brothers. But there again, I think people are being naive if they think any alliance is simply a band of brothers. I mean, even in the Anglo-American alliance during World War II, probably the closest alliance ever in history, where you joined the two intelligence organizations, which, at least for signals intelligence, which is unheard of. There was a lot of deep-seated friction. There were very different interests, and real pushing and pulling. So in this case, I think I completely agree with you. It's way over-interpreting it to say this shows you that it's not. It doesn't matter. It does. It does absolutely matter, and it is consequential. I see we don't have a huge amount of time left, and unless you have things of deeper statesman-like gravity.
I know you want to move on to lighter topics, but before we get there, I do want to just say, we're in the midst of I think the third visit to Washington by Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who had dinner last night with President Trump and has an unscheduled meeting tonight that was suddenly put on the schedule, which appears to be about Gaza ceasefire negotiations. And Bibi clearly came here with a mission to try and get Trump to kind of give him a green light to restrike Iran if we get any indications that they're restarting their nuclear program. I think it's important to note that although Iran has said they're not going to cooperate with the IAEA, at least for the moment, and the inspectors have therefore left, they have not withdrawn from the NPT. And so they've sent a signal, but they haven't committed themselves yet to whether they are going to try and continue to operate a nuclear program within the ambit of sort of, international non-proliferation order, or whether they're going to go completely rogue outside it and try and maybe race to a nuclear weapon. That's a prospect that's got to be a little daunting, because up until the last 2 weeks, they probably thought, no, there's no chance an American president is actually going to order any kind of strike on us because we've been through this, through 4 or 5 presidents. That's now a different calculus for them after the B-2 strike. So, I don't know how successful Bibi has been. The president seems to really want to see the negotiations go forward. Witkoff has said that they could start, tomorrow or next week. It's not clear, but he's ready to go back. President Pezeshkian did an interview with Tucker Carlson, Lord Ha-Ha, who in which he said that they're ready to negotiate, but they have some red lines, which is they don't want Israel to attack them while they're negotiating, and they are not going to negotiate away their right to enrich, although that still leaves a lot of scope for potential elegant solutions, as Steve Witkoff put it, to that problem. By the way, Tucker Carlson didn't ask him the obvious question, which is, if your intentions were so peaceful, because Pezeshkian in the interview was claiming that the concern about their nuclear program was all overblown and created by Bibi Netanyahu, and the president allowed himself to be hornswoggled by this. You would have thought that a real journalist would have said, well, why is it that you had 400 kilos of, uranium enriched to 60%, which no other country that's not a nuclear weapons power in the world has? But somehow that question didn't get asked in the interview. Go figure.
So, Tucker Carlson, Lord Ha-Ha, famous, infamous British trader who actually, I think he was executed after the war for broadcasting for the Germans. Tucker Carlson's some sort of cross between Lord Ha-Ha and Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who was reporting from Russia during the purges and thought everything was just fine. So I get, who knows? I will say one thing. Bibi is another politician who is really easy to hate for very good reasons. And most of my Israeli friends really hate him. For example, he only literally within the last week visited kibbutz Nir Oz, which was one of the kibbutzim on the Gaza envelope, which I have visited, which was one of the worst hit in the attacks. It was just, I walked around. It's devastating. The first time he visited, for a long time he refused to meet with the families. He is doing things to undermine Israeli democracy on the one hand. And I would stipulate that I tend to believe, which I think is the view of a lot of senior people, including senior Israeli military people, that he has willfully prolonged the Gaza war in part to avoid what would be the normal Israeli reaction, which is we need a commission of inquiry, state commission of inquiry by very senior independent officials, no holds barred. This is the way they usually react when you have a major catastrophe. But at the same time, I also think that was probably not what was at work with the Iran strikes. I don't think that was about him simply trying to save his own skin. And so that's, maybe I'm just being insistent on trying to make my point. We have to accept the possibility that sometimes people who we find odious, who really are odious, and who in some cases are downright malevolent and anti-democratic, will sometimes do the right things for the right reasons. And that's just, we all wrestle with what the psychologists call cognitive dissonance. I just think we're in an era where, there are a lot of other psychological disorders people are going through. My daughter is a clinical psychologist. She said, the baseline for depression and anxiety disorders has just gone way up because everybody's depressed and anxious. I would put cognitive dissonance up there with them, and I think we really have to struggle with ourselves. And Netanyahu is a good example of that. I do think, by the way, Gaza is another case where Trump wants to be the peacemaker, and that's not an unworthy objective if he can make it stick. And actually, as I said in this L'Express interview, if he pulls that off, and it's some sort of reasonable settlement that takes the interests of the hapless Palestinian population of Gaza into account in some decent way, and I'm not predicting that, but I'm just saying he would deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, because among other things, would probably pave the way for Israeli relations with Saudi Arabia, which was a very, very big deal.
And maybe with Syria and Lebanon, Tom Barrack, who is the ambassador to
Absolutely.
Turkey and envoy for Syria, is working very hard on that. And look, if they can pull all that off, I will be the first one to give them credit. On Bibi, I guess my view is sort of similar to yours. I mean, I think he did. Look, he's been obsessed about the Iranian threat to Israel for a long time. And I think it's hard to disentangle both the genuine, I think, concern he had about the threat, but also the knowledge that if he didn't do it, his legacy would only be October 7th. And, I do think legacy thinking had something to do with his decision here.
I've been reading the Israeli press on this particular question, and what you pick up is that the Israeli military were the ones who were really pressing to go. Bibi has actually been quite conservative about actually using force. And that one reason is they thought the Iranians were really making the drive to do this, which makes sense given that they've lost everything. But also the Iranians themselves created the opportunity for the Israelis, because by firing those two big missile salvos, in response to which the Israelis began taking out critical air defense nodes, in other words, particularly the radar systems, they set themselves up. They kind of opened themselves up,
right? Yeah.
For the Israelis to execute something that they planned for a long time.
Yeah. All
right, let's talk about happier things, shall we?
Okay, go ahead. Let's move on.
So, summer reading, and I'll let me, if I may, I'll lead off with, I'm sure like you, I read lots and lots of books simultaneously, being a dilettante and having policy attention deficit disorder. So I'm reading, I've read one book. Actually, I've read two books that have really seized me. One is, and then I'm beginning a third. So one is this book by Adrian Phillips called Winston's Bandits, which is about it's Winston Churchill's Maverick Friends is the subtitle. It's about Max Beaverbrook, who was a Canadian, actually, press magnate, and Brendan Bracken, who everybody just kind of loathed as an adventurer, who's also in the press world, who were very important parts of Churchill's circle. And it's, I've read a lot about Churchill, and I thought it was exceptionally good, because these were characters who were really from outside the system. People don't trust them. I mean, a lot of people didn't trust Churchill either. But what Churchill was able to do, which I think is one of the things that made him a great leader, he could absolutely work with people who were inside the system. He worked well with David Margeson, somebody nobody's ever heard of, who was the conservative whip under Chamberlain, who was deeply hostile to Churchill. And Churchill got along just fine. He made use of him. Or, Rab Butler, who was a very, a traditional conservative grandee but Churchill could work. But he also had these other characters around, and how, what they were like, how Churchill made use of them, his blind spots. I thought terrific. I'm beginning a new book by a man named Christopher Summerfield, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at Oxford, called These Strange New Minds, How AI Learned to Talk and What It Means. And we have to have a session about that, because I'm one of these people who believes that we may be looking at the AI apocalypse. And he begins with a very vivid metaphor. Those of a certain age will remember the Roadrunner cartoons, where Roadrunner is always being chased by Wile E. Coyote, and he always somehow manages to create this trap where Wile E. Coyote goes right off the cliff and is kind of madly pawing at the air before he falls into the canyon. He says that's where we are with regard to AI. So I'm just beginning that. It's fascinating. It's quite disturbing, but I think it's a critical part of our future, and we should, at some point, you and I need to talk about it in a more serious way. And then the third book, which is just pure self-indulgence, I reread a book that I first read as a teenager, H. Rider Haggard's She. So this is classic Victorian adventure novel of a couple of Englishmen go deep into Africa, and after various adventures, they end up encountering a queen, a she who must be obeyed, who is a princess who's been alive for the last couple of thousand years. It's a rattling good story. Those people used to know how to tell a tale, and it got me interested in some of the critical writing about it. Turns out a whole bunch of prominent psychologists were fascinated by it, including Freud, and most importantly, Carl Jung, one of Freud's disciples, who was very interested in the kind of irrational side of human nature. So one of the ways that I escape Trump and Bibi and all that is I have this instinct to flee to the 19th century, and the next up is going to be Raphael Sabatini's Scaramouche, which is the French Revolution. So I am like moving backwards fast. What about you?
I am in awe of your ability to read all that stuff. I mean, you can take the boy out of graduate school, but you can't take the graduate student out of the boy. I'm just having trouble keeping up with the various things we have in store for our listeners and viewers down the road, because we have a number of authors who've expressed interest in coming on the show, and books that we're reading, and I'm struggling mightily to keep up, although your mention of the fights among allies, the U.S. and Britain during World War II, is a subject we will return to. But I am, as listeners, longtime listeners know, my summer indulgence is usually to read the new Daniel Silva book in the Gabriel Allon series, Israeli super spy and art restorer Gabriel Allon. It's a wonderful series, and I haven't read it yet, but just on my doorstep has arrived a copy of An Inside Job, this year's new Gabriel Allon mystery. I'm actually catching up with some old ones. I'm reading The Black Widow, which is about 10 years old now, but about the insertion of a Israeli covert agent into the midst of ISIS as they're planning attacks on Europe. So that is also a rip-roaring good yarn, and given what we've seen the Israelis do in Iran, seems willful suspension of disbelief is not terribly difficult to come by when I'm reading this.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I have to say it's been very rare for me to read books that you haven't already read, so I wouldn't discount your reading. I think that's probably it. I'm going to keep an eye out for the Cape Cod horned viper. I mean, I assume they're out there somewhere, and that climate change has probably made them larger and more venomous and more aggressive. But assuming we make it back, next time we'll be coming to you from warm Washington, D.C.